Welcome to our next section, 3.2. We're going to talk about the differences between what are called K-selected and R-selected species. And by the end of this section, hopefully you'll be able to answer these questions. You'll be able to give an example of at least one R and one K-selected species and describe what makes them R-selected or K-selected. So when we're talking about these two things, these are essentially breeding strategies. So the strategies used by an organism to reproduce. So R-selected, I try to always emphasize the lowercase r. These are going to be smaller animals, so you can kind of use that as a bit of a clue. And these types of species, they have what are called high fecundity. So they release large numbers of gametes like eggs or seeds if we're talking about a plant. They typically have a small body size, and because they're smaller, they're going to have an earlier maturity onset. So it doesn't take a whole lot of energy for to raise the young. The R-selected species have a short generation time, meaning that it does not take very long for a species after it's born to go into reproductive age. They typically only reproduce once, but again, they have lots of offspring in that one reproduction cycle. And so the big thing about R-selected species, they have a lot all at once, and they can disperse offspring widely. So because of that, R-selected species have a capacity for much faster or a higher rate of population growth. So their populations will grow much faster than our K-selected species will. And the reason why R-selected species typically go this route is because there is not a lot of survivability from when an offspring is born until they become an adult. So not a lot of the offspring will eventually reach reproductive age. Okay. And because of the fast reproductive and population growth rate, there will typically be a big growth phase and then sometimes bring like a big crash. So these will have cycles where big growth phases, big crash phases, and they'll just keep going like that. But the high growth rate is important because not only will it allow at least some of the offspring to be able to reach reproductive age, but if there is a crash in the population, then they'll be able to get right back to where they started before. Okay, so some examples of our selected species. We got our frog here with all of these eggs around it. And a lot of rodents, so think like rats, and bacteria. Of course, bacteria, you could start with one and by the end of the day have 1 billion of them, depending on how quickly they reproduce. So, I mean, that's just an incredible growth rate. Little joke here, if you enjoy that. So a little bit about our selected species. So a lack of parental oversight for helping their offspring to reach maturity. Okay, now what about K-selected species? So typically these are going to be larger organisms. They have a much longer life expectancy. So as a result, they don't need to have as many offspring at once. So they'll have less offspring. And because they have less offspring, they'll be better able to, or more likely to give parental care to make sure that their offspring reaches maturity. And K-selected species often reproduce more than once during their lifetime. So because of the slow growth rate, so less offspring at once will result in a low growth rate. K-selected species will also not have the crazy cycles typically like our selected species do. They will grow, and then eventually the resources will reach they will become the limiting factor of that population, and they will reach what are called their carrying capacity. And typically, case-selected species will face a lot of competition with other species. So the case-selected species differ from R-selected because they have less offspring, but they give a lot more energy in helping their offspring to reach adulthood. So case-selected species, again, they're going to have better adaptations. They're going to be more likely to be specialists, but they will be more dominant in stable environments and where they can compete for the resources. And the populations are typically going to be at carrying capacity that you'll not see like the huge increase and then crashes like you would for R-selected species. So elephants are a great example. I mean, it takes more than a year for an elephant that is pregnant to have their calf. So, I mean, that's about one of the biggest examples. Sumatran orangutan, large generation time for these organisms. So they reach maturity pretty much very similarly to humans. Blue whales, I mean, the largest organism on Earth. So they also have a long generation time as well as gestation time. Okay, so just to wrap up this section, biotic potential is a concept where if we're talking about a species, this is their maximum reproductive rate, so the maximum amount of offspring that they can have in a given time. Under ideal conditions. So the environment has to be just right. There has to be an abundance of resources. This is the most amount of offspring that they could have. And, a note here, not all species are exclusively R-selected or exclusively case-selected. They might have a characteristic here. They might have a characteristic here. So they might be a blend of these. Okay. And some species even have the ability to change their strategy as conditions in their habitat are changing, which is kind of neat. And finally, a little note about invasive species. So these are species that are introduced into a habitat from a different one. And a case-selected species, these are going to be ones that are going to be negatively impacted by an invasive species because they're adapted to their environment. And if an invasive species comes in, they might outcompete them for what they have worked so hard to be able to do in their niche. Our selected species, these are the ones that are typically going to be very successful invasive species because they can reproduce a lot. And, and a lot of times they might be, and not always necessarily, but they could typically be generalists, which are selected, fast population growth, and generalist being able to outcompete our native species. So our selected species are typically going to be the ones that are very successful because they can reproduce and spread their population very quickly in a new habitat. Okay, so that's the end of section 3.2, and now you can complete the rest of that worksheet.